The room smelled like pine wood and melted wax with that old fireplace crackle humming underneath the chatter. Celeste gasped when she saw the china set. "He left me this." Everyone clapped like it was a coronation. When they handed me mine, it barely weighed anything. Just paper, old creased yellowed at the corners. I unfolded it slowly, expecting a grocery list, maybe a poem. But the moment I saw the signature, my fingertips tingled. They thought they gave me nothing. They had no idea what they handed me. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? If you've ever been underestimated, subscribe. This one's for you. I've never been the favorite. Not in the quiet, bitter way some middle children claim. I mean it in the way where you're simply absent from the narrative, a footnote in your own family. Celeste sparkled since birth. Valedictorian, homecoming queen, married a man with a trust fund and a jawline straight out of a Hallmark movie. Me, I restored old documents, handled brittle parchment with gloved hands, spent my 20s surrounded by ink dust and silence. Mom used to say I was bookish like it was a character flaw. Dad was different. He never said much, but he once handed me a leather-bound journal on my 10th birthday and told me not everything loud leaves a mark, but ink does. He died 3 years ago. Heart stopped while he was pruning the backyard rosebush. Celeste planned the funeral like a charity gala. I sat in the back pew. He left a locked cedar box, said it was to be opened on the third New Year's Eve after his death. No lawyers, no ceremony, just family, his words, not mine. That night had finally come. Ashridge Hollow looked the same as always, snow-dusted roofs, flickering porch lights, neighbors who watched too closely through frosted glass. The house still creaked in all the same places, still smelled like lemon polish and the ghost of old dinners. I almost didn't go, but something in me, something small and stubborn, said, "Show up." So I did. They gave Celeste the china. Uncle Nolan got the watch. Aunt Marin unwrapped a miniature painting Dad had kept by his bedside. Then came mine, a folded sheet of aged paper tied with a thin gold thread. The moment I touched it, my fingers prickled. The smell of iron ink rose faintly from the crease. I didn't react, just nodded and tucked it into my purse. But something had shifted. Not in the room, not in them. In me. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt like the only one holding a match in a house full of dry wood. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table, sunlight catching the steam from my mug, the note lying flat beside it. I hadn't told anyone I still had it. Not that they'd ask. Celeste had posted a picture of the china set within hours. Captioned it, "He always said I was his delicate girl." The likes rolled in, so did the comments, mostly people we went to church with, and people who never remembered my name. I unfolded the paper again, handled it like I would any 18th century letter, even though my hands shook. The ink had faded, but the signature remained strong. S. Whitehall, 1777. I blinked. I knew that name. My breath hitched as I flipped open my work database. Typed slow, deliberate, cross-referenced military archives, early colonial correspondences, independent collectors' ledgers. There it was, Samuel Whitehall, captain, correspondent to General Horatio Gates during the Saratoga campaign. His letters were considered lost, scattered, misfiled after the war, and now one lay in front of me, misunderstood, unloved like me. I snapped a picture and sent it to the only person I trusted with something like this, Noah Levine. We'd worked together in New York. He was sharp, obsessive in the best way, and one of the few who never made me feel like background noise. I added one line, "Does this look familiar to you?" His reply came 20 minutes later. A single word. "Where did you get this?" Followed by, "Don't move it, don't fold it again, I'm driving up." I stared at my phone. Outside, the snow had started again, soft, relentless, and inside my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I knew what I had, but I didn't yet know what it was worth. Not in dollars, not really. What I held in my kitchen might finally tip the balance of power in this family. And for once, I didn't plan to hand it back. Noah arrived just after dark, his coat dusted in snow, his breath visible in the porch light. I opened the door before he knocked. He looked at me, eyes already scanning past my shoulder. "Where is it?" I led him to the kitchen. The letter lay on the table under a glass plate I'd set to protect it. He didn't speak at first, just stared. Then slowly sat down, pulled gloves from his coat pocket, and began examining the paper. The silence was thick, broken only by the soft creak of the chair and the hum of my fridge. Finally, he spoke. "This isn't just authentic." He looked up. "This is museum-level rare." My heart thudded. "From Whitehall." He nodded. "And it's dated 3 weeks before the Fort Ticonderoga withdrawal. That alone makes it priceless." He sat back. "You said your dad gave this to you." I nodded. Everyone else got heirlooms. I got this. Noah let out a breath that sounded like a whistle. Then your dad knew. Maybe not the dollar value, but he knew what it was. I swallowed. It felt like a lump of truth in my throat. Can it be sold? He blinked. Easily. But we'd have to go through a private collector. If it hits public auction, the press will sniff it out. I shook my head. No press, no headlines. Just proof. He tilted his head. Proof of what? That I was never nothing. That I wasn't just background. He looked at me for a long moment, then reached into his bag, pulled out a sealed folder. I know someone, discreet. You'll get the estimate by Friday. I nodded, trying to keep my voice even. Thank you. Noah stood, paused. You want me to stay? The question surprised me, but the answer didn't. No, I said softly. I need to do this part alone. He nodded once, didn't ask again. After he left, I sat alone at the kitchen table, watching the snow drift sideways across the window. For the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I felt loaded, and they had no idea what I was about to fire. The appraisal came back Thursday morning. I opened the email in bed, sunlight spilling across my blanket, Ellis curled at my feet. Noah had written in all caps. Private collector offered $812,000 USD, no press, full transfer. I read it twice, then a third time. My throat tightened, not because of the number, but because of what it meant. That yellowed note they mocked, it was worth more than all their antiques combined, more than the china, more than the painting Celeste hung over her marble fireplace, more than the damn house. My hands trembled as I reached for my tea. The mug clinked against the saucer. Ellis stirred, lifted his head, and blinked sleepily. Mom, just checking something, I whispered. Are we okay? I looked at him, really looked. He didn't care about china sets, or family hierarchies, or the weight of being forgotten. He just needed to feel safe, loved, seen. I smoothed his hair back. We're better than okay. That afternoon, I walked to the town's print shop. Mr. Ludlow raised a brow when I handed him the copy. Just one. Actually, I said, can you make 6 high-quality? Aged edges, same fold marks. He gave me a look but nodded. Same ink tone. Yes, make them look real, but not too real. It took him 3 hours. I waited in the diner next door, ordered coffee but barely drank it. I kept thinking about Dad, about how he always watched even when he said nothing. Maybe this was his final joke, his final justice. Maybe he knew exactly what he was doing when he left Celeste the china and me the revolution. I picked up the copies at dusk. The weight of them in the envelope felt satisfying, like carrying truth. And I knew then I wasn't done, not even close. They'd thrown me the smallest piece, and I'd turned it into power. It was time they saw exactly what I'd done with it. New Year's Eve came again just like it always did. Same snow drifting across Ashridge Hollow. Same yellow porch lights flickering like ghosts refusing to go. I hadn't spoken to anyone in the family since last year. Not one call, not a single message. But that week, Celeste posted a throwback. Her beaming beside the china cabinet. Captioned, grateful for traditions. Grateful for legacies. Legacy. That word stung. So I packed a small ball, tucked the 6 copies inside, and wrapped them in crimson tissue, just like the gifts they gave last year. No return address, just a handwritten tag on each thought you might want a piece of what you missed. One to Mom, one to Celeste, one to Uncle Nolan, one to Aunt Marin, one to the church archivist who always said I dressed too plain, and one for the lawyer who refused to read Dad's will because it wasn't official enough. I mailed them all from the next county, then drove home through silence and fog. I didn't expect a response, didn't want one. But 3 days later, I got a text from Celeste. No greeting, no emoji. Just, did you actually sell it? I stared at it, left it on read. An hour later, another message from Mom. You could have come to us. You didn't have to make a statement. I laughed, alone. At my kitchen table, a candle flickering beside me. They'd made statements my whole life. With their silence. With their smiles when Celeste succeeded. With their empty nods when I spoke. This was mine. Not a scream, not revenge, just a mirror, held up to the people who never saw me. Now they did. And they couldn't unsee it. I poured a glass of wine toasted to the quietest revolution in the history of the Cross family, and smiled. Because power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it folds neatly in 4 fits in a small envelope, and burns forever in someone else's memory. The letter from Mom arrived 2 weeks later. Cream envelope. Her handwriting neat, practiced like always. No return address, no warmth either. Inside a single page, 3 sentences. I don't know what you wanted, but you've embarrassed this family. Don't come back. I stared at the paper, waited for the sting, the guilt, the ache of being disowned. But it didn't come. Instead, relief, clean, final. They always said I was dramatic, too sensitive, too quiet to matter. But when I stopped playing along, they didn't know what to do with me. I folded the letter in half, slid it into the fireplace, watched the edges curl black, watched the ink melt into ash. Then I opened Dad's journal, the one he gave me when I was 10. The first page read, "Make space for the story only you can tell." So I did, and now that space was mine, not borrowed, not begged for, not earned through perfection. Claimed, with one quiet, deliberate decision. No going back. And no need to. The week after I burned the letter, I drove 2 hours north past frozen lakes and rusted barns to a quiet town no one in my family had ever stepped foot in. Wellspring. Population 600, 3 antique shops, 1 library, and 1 property listing I couldn't stop thinking about. It was my great-grandmother's house, abandoned, boarded up, left to rot when my mother refused to take it. Too far, she said. Too small, too sad. But I remembered it differently. The peach tree in this yard, the tiny writing desk by the attic window, the way the floorboards sang when I ran barefoot across them. The realtor met me at the gate. "It's old," she warned. "Real old." "I'm not afraid of old," I said. I bought it in cash, used the money from the letter, didn't flinch, didn't negotiate. 2 weeks later, I stood in the center of the living room, dust swirling in the sunlight, and whispered, "This is mine now. Not borrowed space, not tolerated presence, mine." Then I called Noah. "I'm opening an archive," I told him. "Small, local, private collection focus." There was a pause. Then his voice warm, a little stunned. "You're doing it." "I am. I'll send books," he said. "I know." I named it The Quiet Archive. Painted the sign by hand. Hung it on the front porch between 2 wind chimes I found in the attic. Every week, new letters arrived. From donors, historians, even strangers. People sent things they didn't know what to do with. Love letters, war telegrams, unsent apologies. I cataloged each one with care. And I started writing again. Not for them, for me. A short piece for a literary journal about family and silence. A local essay about inherited memory. A blog post titled, "When They Hand You Nothing, Make It Worth Everything." I didn't send it to anyone in Ashridge Hollow. Didn't need to. The message wasn't for them anymore. It was for every quiet girl who got handed the useless thing, the broken chair, the box of dried pens, the unread letter, and turned it into something unshakable. I wasn't done yet, but I'd already built more than they ever expected, and I'd only just begun. The calls started slow. A voicemail from Aunt Marin. She happened to drive past Wellspring, saw the sign out front. "It's lovely," she said. "I didn't know you were curating." I didn't call back. Then Celeste emailed. Subject line, question about the letter. No greeting, no apology. Just, was it real? And did you really sell it for that much? I stared at the screen, then closed my laptop. They weren't reaching out because they missed me. They were reaching out because I had something they couldn't touch. Validation, the kind they never gave, never believed I deserved, until someone else did. And I wasn't going to hand it over now. Instead, I made a copy of the appraisal, framed it in glass, hung it in the back room of the archive, just below a plaque that read, "Donated in memory of S. Whitehall and every story that nearly stayed lost." Visitors noticed. Sometimes they asked. I just smiled, let them wonder. That spring, a local journalist visited the archive, wrote a piece titled, "The Woman Who Built Legacy Out of a Letter." It went semi-viral in our state history circles. Small wave, big ripple. One night, Noah sent a screenshot. Mom had shared the article on Facebook. No caption, just the link. That was all she wrote. But it said enough. The same woman who once gave me silence now posted proof that I had something to say. And maybe deep down, she knew I always did. I printed the article, tucked it into the archive's guest book. Next to it, I placed a quote, something Dad wrote in my journal once, years before he died. "They won't always understand, but keep writing anyway." So I did. I wrote, I rebuilt, I rose. Not to spite them, not to shame them, but because I finally knew who I was without their applause. And that was the most valuable thing I ever inherited. I didn't expect her to show up. Not in Wellspring, not after everything. But one Thursday afternoon, as I was cataloging a bundle of 1920s postcards, the bell above the archive door chimed. I looked up. There she was, Mom, wrapped in a wool coat I hadn't seen since Dad's funeral. Same tidy bun, same lipstick, just a touch faded. She didn't speak at first. Just looked around at the shelves, the handwritten signs, the quiet sunlight falling across the original S. Whitehall letter, now encased in glass and properly labeled. Her eyes landed on the guest book, on Dad's quote, and stayed there. "Junia," she said finally, her voice softer than I remembered. "I read about the place." I nodded. I figured, "It's..." She paused, searched for the right word. "Remarkable." I said nothing, let the silence stretch. She looked smaller somehow, not in stature but in certainty. Like the years had chipped away at the marble she used to wear as skin. I came, she said, because I wanted to see what you made of it. The letter. It wasn't just the letter, I replied. It was what it stood for. She blinked, waited. For all the things you said didn't matter. All the things I was told weren't valuable. That I wasn't valuable. Mom's shoulders sank. I didn't mean to. You didn't have to mean it. You just had to keep doing it. She looked away, toward the shelves, toward the work, toward everything I built with the scraps she thought were beneath her. I suppose, she whispered, you got the last word. I shook my head. No, I just wrote my first one. We stood there, two women surrounded by memory, one clinging to what was lost, one standing in what she reclaimed. She pulled something from her coat, an envelope. I found this in Dad's drawer. It had your name on it. She handed it to me, then turned, left without another word. I didn't open it right away. Let it sit for hours on the edge of my desk, like a ghost that hadn't decided if it wanted to be seen. When I finally unfolded the flap, my hands trembled. Inside a single note, my father's handwriting. Dictas. If you're reading this, it means they still don't see you. But I always did. This letter belongs with you because you're the one who'll know what to do with it. I pressed the paper to my chest, let the tears fall. Not for sorrow, not even for closure, but for recognition. For all the years I whispered to rooms that never listened, and finally heard someone whisper back. From then on, every time a young girl walked into the archive, hands full of folded papers, unsure if they mattered, I told her everything has a story, and so do you. And I meant it. Because someone once told me, and this time I believed them. Spring came slow to Wellspring. The frost lingered past April, and the peach tree in front of the archive bloomed later than usual. I didn't mind. Some things take time to open. The quiet archive had grown. Not in size, still just 3 rooms and a crooked staircase, but in soul. People came, wrote letters, donated pieces of their forgotten history. Sometimes they just sat in the reading room, coffee in hand, breathing. One afternoon, a girl no older than 16 walked in, carried a shoebox full of papers tied with blue ribbon. My grandmother never threw anything away, she said, half embarrassed, half hoping. We sat on the floor together, knees touching, as we unwrapped war letters, ticket stubs, a love note on the back of a train schedule. She looked up at me and asked, "Do stories still matter if no one remembers them?" I smiled. They matter because someone will. Maybe not today, maybe not here, but they always land somewhere. Just like mine did. Mom never visited again. Celeste never apologized. That chapter closed without punctuation. And I let it, because not every story ends with applause. Some just end, and you keep writing anyway. A few months later, I received an invitation. My niece was graduating college. The envelope had been addressed by hand. Inside, a sticky note in Celeste's handwriting. She says you're the reason she chose history. I didn't cry, but I felt something in my chest shift, like a window cracking open in a quiet room. I marked the date on my calendar, not sure if I'd go, not sure I needed to, because sometimes just being remembered is enough. And sometimes being the quiet one means you're the one who hears everything. So, what would you have done? Would you have sold the letter, walked away in silence, or handed them the truth folded 4 ways and let them choke on it? Let me know in the comments. And if this story found you, hit subscribe. You're not alone in the quiet.